folks, and welcome to the Horror. Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Horror Corner. I'm your host, Sean Patrick Urshan, and this week we are ranking the horror icons. Yes, and this is a tier list ranking. I had so much fun doing that the last time that I figured I'd give this one a try. Because I have seen a few people do this one, but it just looked like so much fun. I wanted to try it, even though it is kind of a monumental task. So I saw Christian Hannah Horror do that over at Planet CHH. I saw Cody Leach do it. And I saw Jen and Christian over at Jen's Reviews from the Grave. Shout out to my fellow horror brethren. Yeah. But yeah, there's just so many horror icons. It's really tough to decide which ones to include on this list, and even tougher what not to include on this list. Because I didn't want to include a whole lot of really obscure characters. There are a few on there, but I didn't want to just load it up, so I'm sitting here for like 4 hours trying to do this thing. But I tried to include a lot that general audiences know that aren't necessarily horror fans, as well as horror fans, the casual horror fan, and then of course you have the hardcore horror fans. There's stuff here for them too. So I like to think it's a well-rounded list here, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So here's how the tier list goes. So over on the top, you got horror icon is the cream of the crop, the absolute icons of horror history. And then the next one down, the next tier down is legendary status, which may not necessarily be iconic per se, but legendary. And then you have killer that are just very good. They're killer. And then you have amateurs that are just like they're not really that great. And then you have DOA, dead on arrival, which is the bottom of the barrel, the waste of horror, if you will. Okay, so we're gonna start out with a big one here. We got the Alien from the Alien franchise. Yes, where do you think we're gonna put that? I mean, what a great franchise, very interesting franchise. So sure, you got the first two, which are absolutely iconic, immortal films, and I think the creature itself is absolutely iconic. I gotta put the Alien and horror icon for sure. Even though Alien is sci-fi horror, certainly the first film has plenty of horror in it, and I think the creature design is just absolutely brilliant. Of course, the design was created by the artist H.R. Geiger, and he's did such a fantastic job. It's such a freaky looking organism. It's such a horrifying creature, but at the same time, it's like really hard to kill. I mean, the thing bleeds acid. you know, uh, it's got a horrifying tongue that just will destroy your face. It's powerful. It's just terrifying. It's fast. It moves like an animal. Uh, it's just if I ever seen anything like that, I would just die of a heart attack. Before the thing even got anywhere near me. Game would be over. So absolutely horror icon without a doubt. Even though the series itself does go kind of downhill after the first two films, you got those first two films that are absolutely incredible, and the creature itself is phenomenal. Next up, we have Annabelle from the Conjuring franchise. Of course, you got the main Conjuring films, and Annabelle was featured in the first Conjuring movie, and then you had all the spin-offs, and then you had Annabelle, and then Annabelle Creation, and all that. Annabelle Comes Home, or something like that was the last one, I think. I will say I think the Annabelle doll is very creepy, and the fact that it's based on real life, that there is an Annabelle doll in real life that is considered the most haunted um, doll in history. There's so much history behind the doll. Although the real life doll doesn't look anywhere near as creepy, it's just like a Raggedy Ann doll. They do a great job in the film just making it look creepy as hell. But the movies per se are nothing special, really. I thought her appearance in the first Conjuring film was very creepy. But the films themselves are like, okay, there's a lot of typical jump scare stuff. It's tough. It's a tough challenge as to where to put Annabelle on the list. I'm not a huge fan of the films, although I do like the first two Conjuring films. I think are really good. I don't really care too much for the spin-offs, although I do think that the Annabelle doll itself is creepy. I'm gonna put Annabelle in Killer, I think, Not because of the strength of the films, but for the strength of the design of the doll itself and how creepy it is. Next up, we have definitely a modern one. We have Art the Clown from the Terrifier series. Definitely has become extremely popular as of late with the success of the second film and how brutal it was, and how great the character is, and how great the character is portrayed by the actor David Howard Thornton. Um, Man, he has just such a great grasp on the character, and he never says a word, and that's hard. It's like being a mime, but a mime in a film that's also a killer. It's like he's funny at times, he's terrifying at times, he's brutal, and man, such a great character. But where do we want to put him on our list here? Do you think that Art the Clown has reached iconic status? He did start off in the anthology film series there. I forget the name of it, but he started off on I think it's All Hallows Eve. He started in those anthology films, and then they gave him his own film with Terrifier and Terrifier 2. Do you think that's really enough for him to reach icon status? I'd have to say no. I think he needs a couple more films under his belt, and thankfully we do have Terrifier 3 on the horizon. But I'd say we at least still need to see that and see how that film goes before we put him in iconic status. I think he's definitely getting there for sure. I mean, he's definitely on the rise to becoming horror icon, but not quite there yet. So I'm going to say legendary. Next one's a tough one. The Candyman, played so well by Tony Todd, and I think that's what makes the films. Never been a huge fan of the Candyman films per se, but I do think that that character is really interesting and played so well by Tony Todd. I mean, he just kills it. I do think the first film was solid for sure, and it's a really cool concept for a slasher killer. Um, and it was done quite well in the first film, but I feel like the subsequent sequels were pretty weak. So it's tough. I mean, where do I put it? I know a lot of people know the Candyman, but I don't know if I'd quite put him in iconic status. Do I think he's legendary? Yeah, I think I'll have to say the Candyman is legendary status. I wouldn't quite put him in hard icon because the subsequent sequels were pretty weak. But off the strength of that first film and the character itself, and the portrayal by Tony Todd, yeah, I think that's enough to put him in legendary status for sure. Next up is another one from the Stephen King world, and we have Sissy Spacek as Carrie White. Very interesting character with telekinetic powers, who is basically driven to the point of insanity. She doesn't start out as a villain. She's basically like driven to be a villain, by her own mother, by her classmates in school. They all drive her to madness, and at the end, she just flips out and kills everybody, you know. And she uses her powerful evil, and she locks everyone up in the school and the dance hall where they're having the prom night. Uh, yeah, terrifying, and she's extremely powerful. Where do we want to put her? I mean, it's not really huge as a franchise per se. There was the Rage Carry 2, which a lot of people don't really even know exists. And then you had the remake that was made for television. I think that was in early 2000s. And then you had the remake starring Julianne Moore and Chloe Grace Moretz, which is pretty solid, but nothing special. Kind of or basically a rehash of the original. So yeah, the original is where it's at as far as it being a franchise. Nothing comes close. Do I think Carrie White as a character is iconic status? It is a classic horror film, but yeah, I don't know if I would put uh, her in iconic status. I would think I would put her in legendary. Yeah, so another one for the legendary tier. The next one is a tough one for me. I know it wouldn't be tough for a lot of people. Chucky from the Child's Play franchise. It's tough for me because I'm honestly not a huge Chucky guy. I do enjoy the film and I think they're fun slasher films, but that's about as far as I go with it. I will say that I do not consider Child's Play, the first movie from 1988, or any of the films in the franchise to be a horror classic, you know? And that's the problem I have with it. Chucky may be a well known character and part of pop culture for sure. Everybody knows who Chucky is. But are any of the films classic? Are they classic horror movies? Not at all. To me, they're just like fun slasher movies. I like them. They're a good time. They're funny. I just don't take them that seriously. I just think they're funny and silly, and I just have a good time with it. I don't think there's anything more to it than that for me. So it's tough for me. I just don't think Child's Play belongs in the conversation when it comes to classic horror films. But, you know, it's hard to argue that everyone in the freaking world knows who Chucky is and that Chucky is from the Child's Play series and that it's a killer doll with a bunch of movies about this killer doll. So, reluctantly, I'm going to have to put him in horror icon status just because he's such a figure in pop culture. He's just a part of pop culture. Everybody knows who he is. So, reluctantly, I'm going to put him in horror icon. I would put him at killer if it was just me deciding on my own. But I have to take into account the status in pop culture. Next up, we have Esther from the Orphan series. You had Orphan, the original film from the early 2000s there, and then you had Orphan First Kill, which came out recently, which was a very big surprise. I thought it was a pleasant surprise. I really enjoyed the film. I was remember thinking before it came out, I'm like, How are they gonna pull this off? This movie is supposed to be a prequel, yet the actress, Isabel Furman, that plays Esther, is so obviously older, yet she's supposed to play herself younger. Like, how are they gonna pull this off? But they didn't really, in a way. You can tell still that she is older, but I think the movie itself is a lot of fun. There's so many twists and turns. It's just like batshit crazy at times. It's fun. Uh, yeah, I do enjoy, and I love the first film. I think it's just great. I think Isabel Furman's performance as that character is just brilliant. I think it's one of the best examples of child actress performance, for sure. Even though it ends up differently towards the end, but I'm not going to spoil that. So where do we want to put Esther, the orphan, in our tier list? Certainly not icon. Is she legendary? I don't know if she's quite that big or that well known. And there have been so many films of that ilk in history of horror. There's been a lot of films like that. So we have seen it before, but I think I'm gonna have to put Esther in Killer because I do really enjoy Isabel Furman's performance so much. But I don't think she's quite legendary and certainly not horror icon. So yeah, Esther goes in the Killer slot. Next one is just an absolute no-brainer. You got Frankenstein's monster. I mean, come on. Obviously, it's horror icon. I mean, there's no question about it. It's a massive, huge part of horror history, and without the Universal monsters, what would horror be today? I have no idea. Would it even exist? Probably would exist, but who knows what it would be like? Yeah, it's just ingrained in pop culture. Everybody knows Frankenstein's monster. Everybody knows that look from the original Universal monster film from the 1930s. It's just classic. It's immortal, and Boris Karloff's portrayal is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, he's just brilliant. Yeah, and there have been other great iterations of the character, like of course in the Hammer's Frankenstein series, you had Christopher Lee portray the monster. You had other David Prowse portray the monster in some of the sequels. But certainly Boris Karloff is the iconic portrayal of that character, without a doubt. So yeah, Frankenstein's monster is absolutely horror icon, no question. Next up is a tough one. We got Jigsaw from the Saw franchise. Um, Great character, very interesting. I love his motivations. The fact that he was diagnosed with cancer, and he's made it his mission in life to. He feels his mission in life is for good. To get rid of these people that are just the dregs of society, that are just scumbags. Take out the trash, but without actually killing them himself. He just sets up these traps for people to, they can either escape, maybe they'll survive, or they'll die and they won't, they'll be killed by the trap. And there's so many elaborate traps that you see throughout each movie, and that kind of becomes the fun point of each movie is what kind of trap is he going to do now. And it's the creative kills. And Jigsaw as a character is great, played so well by Tobin Bell. Of course, his character actually dies in the third film, so everything after that, it's just like what he set up beforehand before he died. It all comes into play, and that kind of drains the series after a while. It's like, well, he died back in the third film. How many movies are they gonna make? Um, But you cannot deny the success of Saw. I mean, you had a new film come out every year on Halloween, and it was always the number one movie in the world, like every time. Just a hugely successful franchise and very recognizable character. So, where do we want to put him on the tier list? Gonna have to say, does he reach iconic status? I don't know. It's tough. Jigsaw as a character himself, as a villain. Like I said, due to the success of the franchise, you can't deny it. I mean, yeah, I'm gonna have to put him in horror icon just because I mean, it's such a successful franchise. Yeah, just like I said, every time we came out, it was like the number one movie. Everybody had to see it every year. Man, yeah. So Jigsaw goes in the horror icon. Next up is something similar to Chucky for me personally is the Leprechaun and the Leprechaun franchise. I feel the same way about the Leprechaun franchise as I do the Chucky franchise, the Child's Play films. A lot of people wouldn't agree with me on that. A lot of people would say, "Oh, the Child's Play series is way better than Leprechaun's just ridiculous." But to me, it's like the same kind of thing. It's just fun slasher films. None of them are anywhere near being a classic, but what I appreciate about The Leprechaun is right from the get-go with that first movie, you know what you're getting into. You know what you're in for, and that's just a fun, silly, ridiculous, good time, you know? And that's what you get with Leprechaun. They're all fun. I laugh hysterically in some of them. And I love Warwick Davis in the role of the Leprechaun. It's just great. It's so entertaining. It's so funny, and I enjoy it. But is the Leprechaun a horror icon? I'm not sure. I know he certainly is very well known, but I don't know if he's as well known as Chucky or anyone in the horror icon tier up there. I think most people just laugh at it and think it's ridiculous. Most people don't think it's a good franchise. Most people would say that they're bad movies, that they're really B movies, and yeah. So it's tough. As much as I like the Leprechaun and the franchise personally, I'm gonna have to put it in killer. I don't think it's quite legendary or horror icon status, just because yeah, most people know him, but they think the series is terrible. So that's the thing. So I'm gonna have to put him in killer. Now we have one of the new horror stars of the day. Megan from the Megan film. What do you guys think about that? I really, really enjoyed Megan. I thought it was great. And man, you can't deny how popular it was. I mean, that one scene with Megan doing a little dance there before she stalks the guy, is that just went viral. I mean, that was everywhere. And Megan was a very successful film, not only commercially but critically. It was absolutely applauded by critics. It had like a 90 something percent rating on Rotten Tomatoes. I think it still does. So yeah, it did very well, very successful, and very critically acclaimed. And I agree with the critics. I think it's. Let me put it this way: the Child's Play remake, which I really enjoyed from back in, I think it was 2018. I like what they did. They did something different. It was a remake, so they made it their own, and they came up with something new and different. And I really enjoyed the fact that Chucky was artificial intelligence. But, they could have done more with it. It could have been handled a little bit better. And I think that Megan is basically like the potential that the Child's Play remake had. I feel like it reached the full potential that that film had, so yeah, I really enjoy Megan. Is she at iconic status? Definitely not. I mean, there's only one film to go by. There is another one on the horizon. There is going to be a Megan 2. So we'll have to see how that goes. Maybe I would put her higher on the list later on, but right now, not quite legendary either. I really enjoy the film, but she's not quite legendary status yet. It's too soon to say, so I'm gonna put her in killer. Next up, we have kind of a one-shot slasher that certainly the horror fans all know, and even general horror fans know, just because of the iconic look of the killer. And that mining outfit is such a cool, like, look for a slasher killer. And that's why I put him on this list because a lot of people remember that. It's definitely a memorable look, and I love that film. I love My Bloody Valentine from 1981. I think it's a classic slasher film. It's like a perfect slasher movie. Uh, based around the holiday, back when those all those slasher movie films came out with that took place on like specific holidays, like Valentine's Day, Halloween, graduation day, all that stuff. And I think My Bloody Valentine is definitely one of the best of those one shot kind of holiday themed slashers. Yeah. Yeah, so the killer from My Bloody Valentine, I know a lot of people call him Harry Warden, but if you watch the film, it's only Harry Warden in the beginning. The rest of the film, it's somebody else, and I won't spoil that who that is, but Harry Warden is only the killer at the beginning. But at any rate, My Bloody Valentine. Where do we want to put My Bloody Valentine? I certainly don't think he's iconic status. Really, only horror fans know who he is and what the film is. Um, I don't think legendary status would fit either because he only was in the one film and then there was one remake and that's it. So that's not really a franchise. So I don't think I could say that he's legendary either. So I'm going to say killer on that one. Next up we have the infamous Norman Bates, played by Anthony Perkins in the original film Psycho, based on the Psycho novel by Robert Bloch, was it? And of course, the character of Norman Bates is based on a real life killer by the name of Ed Gein. Now, of course, the image of Ed Gein was definitely glamorized, I guess, in the Psycho movie. The actual Ed Gein wasn't nearly as charming and good looking as Norman Bates is in the Alfred Hitchcock film, but at any rate, definitely the psychotic nature of Norman Bates is there. And yeah, Anthony Perkins' portrayal of Norman Bates is absolutely brilliant. And the thing is, Psycho is a franchise, and a lot of people forget that, and they forget about the sequels like Psycho 2 and Psycho 3 and Psycho 4, which are really good, so underrated as a franchise because everybody just remembers that first original film. And then, of course, you had the TV series, which I thought was very good too. Yeah, I mean, do we really have to think about it? Obviously, Norman Bates is horror icon. Come on. No question about it. And then the next up, we have kind of a similar character in Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. Some people debate whether American Psycho is actually a horror film, but I think it is. I definitely think he belongs here on this list. It's definitely like a slasher killer character, serial killer. Um, yeah, the fact that it's such a dark, uh, like a lot of people would consider it a black comedy, which, yeah, this certainly is that without a doubt, but I do think it qualifies as a horror film as well. Um, just because of how brutal Patrick Bateman is, and he exhibit he exhibits a lot of traits of the classic kind of slasher killer. Um, yeah, and it's obviously a knock on society, corporate society, the yuppies, and how they're like one indistinguishable from the next. That's kind of the point they're making. That that these white bread rich guys, businessmen, these business tycoons over on Wall Street, and how they could just get away with murder, literally, that you would never ever suspect someone like that to be a murderer. And yeah, he's the worst of the worst. He's out there at night picking women off one by one, like Ted Bundy, just brutal, and luring them in with his good looks and his charming persuasion, his well spoken nature. Yeah. Patrick Bateman, what a great performance by Christian Bale, who's just one of the best actors in the world, right now. No question about it. He's an Oscar winner, and this is certainly one of his best performances, probably his most iconic performance, next to Batman, I would say. But where do we want to put him on the tier list? Where do we want to put Patrick Bateman? Do you think he's a horror icon? Not quite. I mean, he only played the character in the one movie, so I wouldn't put him in horror icon status. But he certainly is very well known. I think he's better than Killer, just because the performance by Christian Bale is so great. And yeah, a lot of people remember that film. And you gotta love his taste in music and how his obsession with music comes into play. It's always a lot of fun watching that. How obsessed he is with Huey Lewis and the News, and and Whitney Houston even, and Phil Collins. It's hilarious. Next up, we have Pennywise from the remake of Stephen King's It, from back in 2017. And then you had the sequel, of course, It Chapter 2, which came out a couple of years later. And you had Bill Skarsgård in the role of Pennywise, the dancing clown. Really enjoyed that first film. I thought it was really well done. And I liked it a lot better than the old miniseries from 1990 there, um, which you had Tim Curry playing the role of Pennywise. It was kind of a made for TV miniseries. But a lot of people remember Tim Curry as that character. And, a lot of people debate, who's better, Bill Skarsgård. I certainly think Bill Skarsgård is the scarier version of Pennywise. And it's tough because Tim Curry is such a great actor, and he did do a fantastic job. He's certainly the best thing about the original miniseries, without a doubt. But there's a lot of good things about the remake from 2017. It's so well filmed, so well directed, and acted. You got a great cast of young actors playing the teenagers. Um, yeah, it's just a great film. Um, Chapter 2 wasn't quite as good, but definitely that first remake was very good. And I think Bill Skarsgård nails it as the character. I mean, he's scary, And he certainly got a little humor too. To Where do we want to put Pennywise, the dancing clown from the It remake? Ugh, I definitely wouldn't put him in iconic status, although you could certainly make a case for that. I mean, Pennywise is very, very well known in the pop culture. You see so much merchandise with Pennywise in the stores. You see all the action figures and the T-shirts and the memorabilia, all kinds of it stuff out there. Even now, even though it's been a while since that movie came out, people still remember it. I'm gonna put him in legendary. Yeah, for sure. Definitely his impact on pop culture is huge, and it's a great story from the Stephen King novel, very well adapted. Next up is a tough one because it's a film that I absolutely love. It's one of my favorite horror films of all times, and I think the character of Herbert West, played by Jeffrey Combs, is actually my favorite horror performance by an actor. And Reanimator was a pretty solid franchise too. You had the original as a classic. You had Bride of Reanimator, which I think is very, very underrated. I love that film. And Beyond Reanimator was all right. Jeffrey Combs is definitely the best part about Beyond Reanimator. I feels like there's some things missing when you watch Beyond Reanimator. You don't have Dan in there. You don't have Megan Halsey. There's something missing when you watch Beyond Reanimator. It's like just Herbert, and that's it. There's no Dr. Hill. That's the only thing that sucks about it. But yeah, definitely the character of Herbert West, created by H.P. Lovecraft on his original short story. Absolutely love it. It's so well adapted, even though, they take a lot of liberties with the story in the film, but I love what they do with it. It's got amazing gore effects. It's scary. It's funny. It's wild and crazy. It's just batshit, and I love it. So I know that Herbert West is definitely not a horror icon, but to me, he's legendary. I'm putting Herbert West in legendary. I don't care. Movie's awesome. Jeffrey Combs is freaking phenomenal in that role. I love the character. I love the series. He's legendary. you know. Next up, we have Reagan from The Exorcist, or you can call her the demon Pazuzu, whatever you want. But the girl Reagan, played by Linda Blair, is possessed by the demon called Pazuzu, who claims to be the devil himself. Absolutely iconic film without a question, an absolute horror classic. But is the character of Regan iconic? That's tough because certainly in the makeup, you can make a great case for possessed Regan being iconic because the imagery, the images of Regan in the makeup with the voice, your soul is mine. She's got 1,000 different voices, and it's just insane. She has all kinds of like telekinetic power. Even strapped to the bed, she can do a lot of damage. And she kills people. Makes it look like an accident, similar to like the Element series with Damien. But yeah, such a phenomenal film to me. The Exorcist, the original film, is a 5-star masterpiece. As far as The Exorcist as a franchise goes, it's not as good. Obviously, Linda Blair did return for Exorcist 2 The Heretic, which is not a great film by any means. Had a great cast, but man, I don't know what the hell they were thinking with that movie. Ugh, it's rough. It's a tough watch, trying to sit through Exorcist 2 The Heretic. They do kind of redeem it a little bit with Exorcist 2. I know a lot of people love Exorcist 3, and think some people think Exorcist 3 is the best film in the series. I definitely don't agree with that, but it's definitely redeems the second film, that's for sure. But then you had the beginning, and you had Dominion, which were pretty much the same film, only you know They kind of rearranged it with different scenes. They were kind of filmed around the same time, I believe, by different directors, using the same actor as Father Merrin. They're both prequels to the original film, and neither one of them is very good. They do have a new film coming out soon, the Exorcist film, and Ellen Burstyn returns to the series. Not sure why Linda Blair isn't coming back in some shape or form, but we'll see how that goes. But let's see, where do we want to put Regan in our tier list? Uh, um, we only have two films to go by, um, and one of them is terrible. So I'm gonna put her in legendary. I do think that she is kind of iconic in pop culture, certainly very, very recognizable in horror history, but I don't know if I'd go so far as to say she's iconic. So yeah, I'm putting Regan in legendary. Next up, we have Samara from the Ring films, or Ringu was the original Japanese version. Yeah, Samara was the American remake, which I really enjoyed. I thought the first Ring film was great with Naomi Watts. Very scary, very intense. And I mean, who doesn't remember that scene where Samara comes out of the well and comes through the TV screen? I mean, how scary was that? That was just brilliant. Man, just by judging from that scene alone, that scene itself is iconic, I would say. But I don't think Samara would be considered horror icon by any means. And then you had the Ring 2, which was not great. You had The Rings. Um, yeah, I'm gonna put Samara in killer. Yeah, definitely not legendary. Definitely not horror icon. I think she belongs in killer. Next one is tough. You got the Creeper from the Jeepers Creepers franchise. That's a tough one because I think it's such a great design for a creature. It's so creative. And the makeup job is great. I love the costume. He's a scary character. The problem is the movies are not great. That first movie is definitely very good. It's a good scary film, and but once you get past that first film, Jeepers Creepers 2, Jeepers Creepers 3 is just straight out bad. Even though it is kind of fun to watch, but it is like a train wreck. And then you got the horrible Jeepers Creepers Reborn is just horrible. But it's tough because it's such a great creature. It's like, oh man. And then of course you have the exploits of the director, very controversial. Uh, I'm gonna have to put the creeper in amateur. I think he deserves to be in killer, but the strength of the films themselves are pretty weak. But yeah, Jeep's Creepers, we have our first amateur. Yeah, reluctantly though. I would put him in killer if it wasn't for the fact that the sequels were so bad. It's tough, know, because that has so much potential to be like the Creeper could be an iconic status as far as the design of the creature, how cool it is, but unfortunately, he goes an amateur for now, unless somebody takes the franchise and makes a great movie out of it. Next up, we have The Fly, Jeff Goldblum in the remake of The Fly, and then you had the original Fly, of course, from Universal Films. Both pretty quite recognizable. The original Fly is a classic film, from Universal. And then you had the sequel, Return of the Fly, and then you had this great remake from David Cronenberg, who's such a great director, so creative, and man, I love what he did with this film. Absolutely incredible practical effects, just grotesque, just horrifying. I mean, the makeup job is just insane. Some of the best practical effects ever made, no question about it. I love Jeff Goldblum's performance. Uh, yeah, it's a great film. One of the great remakes of all time, on The Fly from David Cronenberg. But where do we put The Fly in our list here? I definitely would not say it's horror icon, but I think the strength of the remake and the strength of the practical effects, I'd have to put him in legendary. There you have it. The Fly is in legendary status. That list is building up quite a bit there, but we got a long way to go here. Next up, we have the Mummy. And you can also include Hammer's version of Mummy. I actually prefer the Hammer version of the Mummy. But you can't deny how great Boris Karloff was in the role of Imhotep in the original Mummy film from Universal. The problem I have with the original Universal film is it's so slow. I mean, it really drags. The one thing that saves it is the performance of Karloff. He's so great. He's so menacing in the role. He really chews up the scenery. Another thing that sucks about the original is you only see him as the mummy, as the monster in the beginning, and then after that he's in human form really for the rest of the film. But in a way, it's good because you get to really see, Lon Boris Karloff, outside the makeup, really giving a great acting performance without all the bandages and the prosthetics on him. You get to hear that really deep baritone voice of his, so iconic. But do we want to put the character of the mummy in iconic status? That's tough, because I don't think the mummy series is as strong as the others. It's not as strong as Dracula or Frankenstein or even the Wolfman, I would say. So I'm gonna put the mummy in legendary, and that includes the Hammer Mummy films too. As a franchise, it's definitely the weaker of the series of Universal films. Even the Hammer series, it's a little bit rough. Although you do have Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, which I love, and the original Mummy from Hammer is great. But you got a couple weak ones in there. Curse of the Mummy's Tomb is kind of weak. The Mummy's Shroud. Same thing with the Universal films. Those aren't too great either. The sequels, but judging off the original films from Hammer and Universal, are both great. So that's enough to put them in legendary. Next up we have the original Phantom of the Opera film. And also there's been various versions, of course, of Phantom of the Opera. You even had the musical version from the 2010s there, with Hugh Jackman was in it, Russell Crowe I think was in it. Actually, was that? I might be thinking of a different one, but there was a big budget musical made on Phantom of the Opera in like 2010 or something, and it was pretty successful. I think I got that mixed up with Les Miserables. Sorry about that. It didn't have Hugh Jackman. That was Les Miserables. But anyway, it's a similar kind of thing. But as far as the horror version goes, the original Phantom of the Opera starring the great Lon Chaney Sr. Um, where do we want to put that in the tier list? Because certainly that's a classic film. It's a silent film. Um, but yeah, what great practical makeup effects from Lon Chaney himself that he created himself. I think the fact that he does that is so cool, the fact that he's the star, he's the main villain, and he also the actor himself is the one that came up with that horrific makeup design. That's so cool. The film itself has never really been one of my favorites. You had some other pretty solid versions too, like the Hammer version of Phantom of the Opera is pretty good. Even you can consider Phantom of the Paradise to be a solid version, kind of a more modern rock and roll version of Phantom of the Opera. Even Dario Argento made a version which was pretty terrible, but we won't talk about that. But as far as the original classic with Lon Chaney Sr., it's tough because I don't know if he's that well known, and I don't know if how great I would consider the original film. It's a solid film. It is a classic film, but not one of the top tier classic films. I'll put him in killer, I think. Next up, we have The Tall Man from the Phantasm series. I love Phantasm. I mean, I think it's so creative. I think the original Phantasm is one of the most creative horror films of all time. It's just got everything. It's got elements of sci-fi. It's so interesting, and it's out there. I love the spheres. It's just a it's a weird film. I love the atmosphere. The first film, especially, is just great. I love the score of that first film. And then, of course, you had Phantasm 2, which was a great sequel. It was, you know, a lot more action. It's a lot more entertaining, probably, than the original film. And I enjoy the rest of the film. So I like Part 4, Oblivion. I even like Ravager, even to an extent. I mean, it's not a great film, but I think it's fun to watch. It's not horrible, but it's not great. But yeah, I enjoy the franchise a lot. I think it's one of the most underrated franchise. And I do consider the original Phantasm to be a horror classic. Not everybody does, but it's certainly not up there with the classics of all time in people's minds. But it is to me. So where do we want to put the tall man? I absolutely love Angus Scrimm as the tall man. What a great character and a brilliant portrayal by the actor in every film. I love Angus Scrimm as the tall man. But I don't think he's iconic really, only because not everybody knows the Phantasm series. I couldn't put him in iconic status, but I think he's better than Killer. I mean, I think he's a great character and I love the franchise, so I'm putting him in legendary. All right, next up we have oh wait. Wait a minute, it's not DOA. Get back there. All right. So, next up we have The Thing from John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982. I mean, when you want to talk practical effects in a movie, oh my God, The Thing is one of the greatest examples of practical effects in a horror film. Brilliant movie, one of the great remakes of all time. It is a remake of The Thing from Another World from the 50s. But I think it's definitely the superior film. It's scary. It's got some of the best practical effects ever and great cast. Such a thrilling movie with great suspense from John Carpenter, the my favorite director of all time. Yeah, it's a great film, but what do we think about the monster itself, the thing? How it can jump from body to body and take over a person and just turn them into a horrific monster. uh, that's a shapeshifter. It's incredibly powerful, hard to kill. You gotta burn it. How classic is that test scene? The blood test scene is just infamous. So scary. But the monster itself has so many different looks throughout the film. It never sticks to just one look. It's shape shift. Like it said, it's a shapeshifter. So throughout the film, it's got a lot of different looks. But they're all awesome. But do I want to put it in horror icon, the monster of the thing, the alien that is the thing? No, I'm gonna have to put him in legendary status, I think. I don't think it's I don't think the monster itself is iconic per se. Next up is an absolute no-brainer. I mean, we got the legendary Freddy Krueger from the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. No-brainer, guys. Come on, obviously he's horror icon. He may be the most famous horror icon of all time. Absolutely everybody knows who Freddy Krueger is. And everybody knows Robert Englund, and his portrayal of the character is just iconic. Absolutely iconic. His look, his design, the makeup, and the performance is iconic. And the film is iconic. A Nightmare on Elm Street, the original, is an absolute five-star classic to me, you know. Every time I watch it, it gets better and better. I just appreciate it more and more. Everything about it, down to Freddy Krueger from the cast. You know, you got Heather Langenkamp as Nancy, is a great character. You know, even some of the other characters like Tina and Johnny Depp there in his first film role. Such a great movie with great atmosphere, brilliantly directed by Wes Craven, and I like a lot of the sequels too. I like Part Two, Three, Four. I like Freddy versus Jason. You know, I like the franchise. You know, but absolutely, as a character, he is iconic. There's no question about it. Next up, we have Victor Crowley from the Hatchet series, as played by Kane Hodder. Sorry to disappoint you guys, but I'm putting Victor Crowley in amateur. Never been a fan of this series, never been a fan of the movie. I remember when I first saw the original Hatchet, I remember being excited about it. I'm like, well, the reviews that came out that it was like old school American horror, you know, and then when I watched it, I was like, just the campy acting. I mean, the acting was just insufferable. I mean, it was just I can only handle so much cheesy acting, and that just went over the top for me. I hated the campy acting. That's what killed it for me. I think Victor Crowley is a pretty cool character, and the design is, you know, his makeup job is grotesque. You know, he's a brutal killer. You know, some of the practical effects are pretty awesome, but I just don't care for the movies. I just think they're just B movies. You know, I just don't care for the series. Next up, we have Mick Taylor from Wolf Creek. I freaking love Wolf Creek. I think John Jarrett's performance in that original film is just brilliant. And I thought he could have been the next big horror icon like Freddy or Jason or Michael. I thought he was on his way, and then we just never got a part three, you know, and just stopped at two. And then they did have a TV series, a limited series on, I forget what channel it was on, but and it was pretty solid. It was pretty good. And John Jarrett did return for the limited series too on television, and it was cool, you know. But I wanted a part three. I wanted another movie, you know. I wanted the franchise to continue with John Jarrett, you know. And is it ever gonna happen at this point? Sadly, I don't think it is. You know, it's too much time has passed, and John Jarrett's getting old now. You know, I don't think he's gonna be able to play that character unless they knock it out real quick. You know, I think he's getting too old at this point. You know, so sadly, I think Wolf Creek has come to an end. So because of that, I can't put him in horror icon status, but I love him, so I am gonna put him in legendary status because I think just the strength of John Jarrett's performance in the first two films and the television series is just great. I mean, what a great character, what a great concept. And, the fact that he is based on a real life killer, a couple different real life killers actually in the Australian outback, uh, makes it even more interesting. So, John Jarrett as Mick Taylor goes into legendary. Next up, we have the Wolfman, played so brilliantly by Lon Chaney Jr. Yes, come on now. Of course, he's going into icon. The Wolfman is a damn icon. Lon Chaney Jr.'s performance is one of the greatest, like most tragic figures in film history. I just love his character, and I love all the films in the series. Even when you get into like the House of Dracula, the House of Frankenstein. I love the fact that Lon Chaney comes back every time to play the character. Even Frankenstein versus the Wolfman. Love it. You know, it's great. Even in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, he shows up, and I love it. I love the makeup, that old school practical makeup, and the effect when he's changing is just so iconic and so cool. Even to this day, I think it looks great. What a fantastic film! I love the franchise too, um, and I love Lon Chaney's performance. He's great. Next up, we have Ghostface from the Scream franchise. Yeah, everybody knows Ghostface. I mean, come on, at this point. Series originally created by Kevin Williamson and directed by, of course, the late great Wes Craven. Until, of course, Scream 5 was the first one without Wes Craven because he had passed away, of course, sadly. Um, but they managed to do the series justice with part 5 and part 6, I think. I really enjoyed both of those films. I think the franchise is in good hands going forward, and I think as a franchise, Scream is one of the most consistently good films in all the franchises. There's not one terrible movie, even though most people would say part 3 is the weakest. Even part 3 isn't terrible. It's not great, but it's not horrible. But I'd say most of the films are good. Now, Ghostface as a killer, as a villain, as a character, where do we put him in the list here? Certainly the look of the killer I think is iconic, but each film it's a different person, it's a different killer each time. Is each killer iconic? No. The look and the look of the killer with the mask and the knife and the costume is iconic, but I don't think Ghostface as the killer is necessarily iconic. So I'm gonna put him in legendary. I know a lot of people probably be disappointed with that. They probably say, "Oh, he's horror icon." Yeah, in a way, but in a way he's not too. Next up, we have the Invisible Man from the original Universal Monsters films, and that was a whole franchise too. Where do we want to put? I mean, he's portrayed so well by Claude Rains in that first film, just great. I mean, I do think the original film is a classic. But the rest of the series is like, man, The Invisible Man Returns. Is all right. Some of the other films are okay, but not great. I did like the Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man was pretty cool, but the fact that Claude Rains doesn't return kind of sucks. But that first film is definitely, I would say the first film is iconic, but as a character, I don't know if the Invisible Man is quite really horror icon status. I don't think it's on that level really. I don't think he's on the same level as Frankenstein or Dracula. And I thought the remake was really good too. The recent remake with Elizabeth Moss was great. I thought it was really creative, something different. Uh, uh, hmm. I'm gonna have to stick Invisible Man and Legendary. Not quite iconic, but almost there. The strength of that original film and the recent remake too puts them in Legendary. Next up, we have Jason Voorhees. Yes, the hockey mask madman slasher killer, the indestructible slasher killer from Friday 13th franchise. Obviously, he goes an iconic. Come on. There's no way in hell that Jason Voorhees is not iconic. There's no way. Everybody knows Jason Voorhees. It's like one of the most popular Halloween masks and Halloween costumes of all time. Uh, yeah, I mean, come on now. I love the Friday 13th franchise. Big fan. Not saying every movie is great, but I do enjoy it. I enjoy most of them, especially the first two films. I absolutely love. And I am a big fan of the original film, which I have said many times throughout my channel. I think it's the original film gets a lot of crap, and I don't understand why. I think it's an absolute great slasher film, even though Jason is not the killer in the original film. Jason is in the original film, but he's not the killer. It's just kind of sets up the lore beautifully for the franchise, I think. The story of Jason, the lore of Jason is established in the original. I think they do a great job with it. But yeah, I do enjoy Jason as a. I think Jason's a great character, and we've seen a lot of different actors take on the mantle of Jason, and they've all done a good job. There's never been a terrible performance of Jason. You had Kane Hodder, you had C.J. Graham, which is my personal favorite portrayal of Jason in Part Six. You had man, you had Steve Dash in Part Two. You had a lot of people love Ted White in Part Four, the final chapter. But yeah, Ken Kersinger and Freddy versus Jason, they're all good. They're all good. Kane Hodder and the later films there. Yeah, I love Jason Voorhees, and he's absolutely a horror icon without a doubt. Next up, we're getting into monster territory with King Kong. Yeah, gotta represent the monsters, baby. To me, that's part of horror. To me, that's a subgenre of horror. Monster movies. Absolutely counts, and obviously, King Kong is horror icon, mother effer. Love King Kong. I love the original from 1933. Um, I like the remake from 1977, or was it 76, something like that, with Jeff Bridges and Jessica Lange was really good. I love the recent movies. I love Kong Skull Island. Obviously, Godzilla versus Kong is amazing. It's awesome. And we got another one coming out. I don't know what they're calling it, but it's going to be another Godzilla versus Kong movie, and I can't wait for that. What a great theatrical experience that was, seeing King Kong versus Godzilla, which came out during the pandemic, unfortunately, but that was the movie that brought me back to the theaters. I wanted to see that spectacle. I wanted to see that huge event take place, because yeah, that's absolutely iconic. King Kong is an iconic character, absolutely. Next up, we have the Predator, which is going to be interesting. Where do we put the Predator? I mean, I love the first Predator movie, but as a lot of people say, it's also the typical Arnold Schwarzenegger action movie. It's not all about the Predator, but the Predator is such a cool monster. It's such a creative design, the character, the look of the Predator, the character itself, how it's a hunter, he can turn invisible and just hunt people in the jungle, and he's got all these crazy weapons, the lasers, the laser gun on his shoulder, and the it's crazy. Awesome, awesome character, fantastic creature design. That's right up there with the Alien as far as I'm concerned. I mean, amazing practical effects in the Predator. As a franchise, it gets kind of messy. I mean, I wasn't a huge fan of Predator 2. It was okay. Then you got Predators was not great. The Predator was not great. I liked Alien versus Predator. The first one was a lot of fun, but then you had the second one, Requiem was terrible. So it's a little rough, but we did get Prey, which was really good. The made for Hulu film. I thought was a great return to form for the franchise. So, where would we put the Predator? If you judged it on the creature itself, the Predator, I would put it in horror icon. But you also got to take into count the franchise as a whole. And when you do that, I can't quite put him at horror icon. I got to put him at legendary because there's some clunkers in the series. Yeah, and even the original film, it was also like half Arnold Schwarzenegger action film as much as it is about the Predator. Next up, we have the Wishmaster. Yes, the Jinn from the Wishmaster, played by Andrew Divoff in the first two films, anyway. After that, it was a different actor, but oh man, I always enjoyed the Wishmaster. I love those first two films, but they are kind of like B movie territory. I love the character and I love the concept of the Wishmaster. I love the concept of that character, the Jinn. I think is such a cool idea for a horror movie, and I think in some levels it works really well. And I think Andrew Divoff is fantastic in that role. I think he's so charming when he plays the human character of the Jinn. And as the monster, what a cool look for a monster too. The Jinn is such a cool like look for a horror character too. And I just think the concept is brilliant. I wish they could have done more with it. I wish it could have been like a bigger budget, and I wish kind of a better director would have taken the mantle. And I wish actually Wes Craven directed it himself. It's just a Wes Craven like he only produced it. He didn't direct it. I wish he would have actually directed it. Then it would have been fantastic. I think in the right hands, the Wishmaster could have been horror icon. But unfortunately, I do like the second film, but it was kind of campy B movie territory. And then it goes downhill after that. So as much as I want to put him in legendary status, personally, I'm gonna put him in killer because the films aren't really that well known, and as much as I loved Andrew Divoff's performance, I can't quite put him in legendary. Next up, we have Angela from the Sleepaway Camp series. Yeah, love the character, and I love that first film. I think it's one of my favorite like slasher movies. Really, it's such an interesting film too. It's something totally different when you're dealing with kind of gender issues too, and I thought that was something that was very relevant, especially today. But back then it was very kind of like taboo and interesting. It was like something that really threw for Lupas, and one of the most like shocking endings in horror film history. Actually, nobody saw that coming. And I love it for that. And another thing that gets overlooked is the sequels, part two and part three, with Pamela Springsteen taking over the role of Angela. I love her performance. I love Sleepaway Camp 2, Unhappy Campers. Even Teenage Wasteland, I really enjoy. I find myself just laughing like hysterically. There's so much fun. Yeah, it's such a fun series. Of course, when you get to return to Sleepaway Camp is absolutely awful, and you have that whatever you want to call that Sleepaway Camp 4: The Survivor. It's not really a movie. It's only like 20 minutes of actual new footage, and it's bad. It's really just a looking back at the first 3 movies, really. But yeah, I love the character of Angela, and I love the first 3 Sleepaway Camp movies. Some would say that they're like B movies, they're like cheesy slashers, but definitely can't put her in horror icon status. But I am gonna put Angela in legendary. I love the Sleepaway Camp films. I think they're so much fun. I think they're underrated, highly underrated, especially the part 2 and 3. I think she belongs in legendary status. I do. Most people probably put her in killer, but no, I'm putting her in legendary, baby. Next up, we have Annie Wilkes, of course, from the film Misery, one of my all-time favorite Stephen King adaptations. What a great movie with a great performance by Kathy Bates, an Oscar-winning performance by Kathy Bates in that film, as Annie Wilkes. Such a great story, and it's so well directed by Rob Reiner, I believe it was. And it's just a fantastic film. It's a classic to me. I think Misery is a classic. But, unfortunately, we only have the one film to go by. As great as her performance was, as great a character as Annie Wilkes is, this crazy stalker who is obsessed with this writer, and so much so that she, you know, so much so that she takes him into her house. She sabotages his car and makes him crash. In the snowstorm, and he's almost dies. So she has to nurse him and take care of him. Of course, she's a nurse, so she knows what to do to keep him alive. You know, but she only does enough to keep him there because that's her plan, to keep him with her forever and relying on her and her nurse abilities because she's obsessed with him. She wants to keep him there. She loves him. She just wants to keep him her slave, basically. It's really messed up. She's a psychotic stalker. And she's the main reason why she's an example of how far a psychotic stalker can go. Brilliant performance, but I can't quite put her in iconic status because it's only the one film, and then I don't think there'll ever be another one. Even though they had her character, I think, in that show, Castle Rock, but yeah, it's only the one film, so I'm only gonna put her in legendary. But yeah, the power of that performance puts her in legendary status. Next up, we have The Blind Man from the Don't Breathe series. There's only the 2 films as of now. I don't know if there will be any others. Kind of doubt it, but you never know. But yeah, Stephen Lang as the blind man in Don't Breathe. Of course, the character's name is uh, Norman Nordstrom, I believe. Funny name. But yeah, he's a veteran. He's an old veteran that got blinded in his service in the military, got injured, and he was blinded. Uh, and yeah, these idiots break into his house, trying to burglarize him, steal his stuff. And they picked the wrong guy to mess with. He's a trained killer. uh, they definitely pick with the wrong guy, and he kills them all. And all except this one girl he keeps alive, and he has a secret, sinister plan that we don't find out about with until the end of the first film. But I also don't care for what they did with him in part 2, how they made him an almost like a sympathetic character. There was a side to him in the original film that was sympathetic, of course, because of course these people are breaking into his house and taking advantage of an old blind man, but they didn't know how brutal he is, how strong he is, how capable he is. They knew nothing about what they were in for. But at the end, we find out that he is the villain. He has very cruel and vicious intentions for this young woman at the end. I won't get into that, but he does some really freaky shit with a turkey baster. I'm not gonna go there, but then again, they kind of in the second film they make him almost like he's protecting this young girl. They almost make him like an anti-hero in the second film, which I don't like because he was straight up villain really in the first film. So based on that, I'm gonna put him in killer. I feel like he had a lot of potential to be legendary, even iconic, if they had kept the series going in the way that he was first meant to be in the original film. He had a lot of potential to be even horror icon, but yeah, as it is, I'm gonna stick him in killer. But great portrayal by Stephen Lang. I mean, he really kills it. Next up, we have The Bride of Frankenstein, which is an interesting one. I mean, it's a great film, one of the all-time great sequels. But as a character herself, where do we fit the Bride of Frankenstein? Such a great performance. But the problem is, we only see her in the film for like 5 to 10 minutes tops. So based on that alone, it's amazing how iconic her look is in pop culture. She kind of is iconic. You gotta say in pop culture, very, very recognizable. The design of that character, the look of that character, the hair with the white streak down. It's very cool look for a character. She's not exactly hideous either. She's actually pretty attractive for a dead person. Ugh. I have a tough one with that because if you look at her status and how well known she is and how iconic the look of that character is, she should be horror icon. But I can't, in all honesty, put her in that category because she's only in the one movie for 5 minutes. I mean, how can she be a horror icon if only 5 minutes of screen time? But I gotta put her in legendary status because of how well known she is and the cool look of the character and the portrayal by Ella Lancaster is great too. And she had to do dual roles in that movie too. She didn't just play the bride; she played the human character as well. Next up, I had to represent the zombie genre. Um, and there are a few zombie characters that are interesting. And there's plenty of great zombie movies, but there's not really that many zombie characters per se that are iconic. But certainly one of them would be Bub from The Day of the Dead from 1985, directed by the great George A. Romero, which is such an underrated film. Only because of the strength of the first two films are absolutely iconic and legendary, and that being Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead are such iconic, legendary films that because of that, I feel like Day of the Dead gets lost in the shuffle, even though it's a great, great film. It's just that the power of those first two films kind of leave it in the dust, unfortunately. But you can't forget that performance of Bub of Day of the Dead. Such a great character and amazing performance, too. Absolutely love that film, and I love the character. I think he's the most recognizable zombie in the history of film, just because of how smart he is and how he has actually learned out of. In the history of zombie cinema, there's not a whole lot of characters that are smart, that actually learns who he was in the past, and he progresses throughout the film. It's a very interesting character. So I'm gonna put Bub in legendary status. Not quite iconic, but only because the first film is not really as highly regarded as the first two. Even though it's a great film and I think it deserves a lot more praise than it gets, I can't quite put him in horror icon. But he's definitely, I think, the greatest zombie character of all time. Next up, we have Damien from the Omen franchise. That's interesting. Where should we put Damien from the iconic film The Omen, which I think is one of the greatest horror films of all time? But the character of Damien himself, the son of the devil, the Antichrist. Um, Such a phenomenal movie. And I love the character of Damien. I love the fact that he makes every death look like an accident. He's never overt with his powers. He's never like you don't see him shooting fire out of his hands or anything crazy. No vulgar displays of power per se. Everything he does is very subtle and he makes it look like an accident. Sometimes he uses animals to, do his evil deeds, like in the first film with the dog and then in the second film with the crow there, and they uses the crow to peck the woman's eyeballs out. And then she gets hit by the truck. That scene's so brutal. I love the second film too. I like The Omen as a series, especially the second film. I think is a fantastic and underrated sequel. Even the third one I liked a lot. With Sam Neill taking over the character as an adult Damien. I thought it was pretty cool too. The final conflict. The fourth film we won't mention. It's just a crappy made-for-TV movie. Nobody cares. But I wouldn't put Damien as horror icon level, but I definitely think he's legendary for sure. Everybody knows Damien. Such a great movie and underrated as a franchise too. Next up, we have Dracula, and I know I could have put several different portrayals of Dracula on this, but I already did that with my vampire tier list. So where do we put Dracula? Obviously, the Bela Lugosi version of Dracula is absolutely horror icon. I mean, come on. Instantly recognizable, Bela Lugosi's portrayal is the most iconic and the most important portrayal of that character, without a doubt. And he plays him in multiple films. He played him in the original version and in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. He reprises his role brilliantly once again in one of my favorite horror comedies of all time, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. So there is one other version of Dracula on this list. So I did put the two most important versions of Dracula, in my opinion, in this list, and we'll get to the other one later. But yeah, Bela Lugosi's version is absolutely iconic. The most copied, the most studied, and the most iconic version in pop culture is Bela Lugosi's version, without a doubt. And definitely horror icon easily. Next up, we have Gojira, Godzilla himself. uh, yeah, he's king of the monsters. So absolutely, he's going in icon, horror icon without a doubt. He's the most infamous, the most famous monster of all time, the most famous kaiju of all time, the biggest king of the monsters. Godzilla. I love Godzilla. I always watched those movies as a kid. Yeah, some of them were cheesy, with just a guy running around in a monster costume, stepping on toys. But still, I love the old Godzilla movies, especially the original film, Gojira, or Godzilla King of the Monsters, the Americanized version of Gojira is great. Absolutely love both versions, and those films are classics. Um, yeah, and even when you get into, Godzilla versus Mothra, or Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, or Godzilla versus Hedorah, or whatever, they're great. And I love the new versions too. I love the new version of Godzilla from 2014 by Legendary Films. In that franchise, Godzilla versus Kong is great, and the new version of Godzilla King of the Monsters with Ghidorah and all that. Yeah, I mean, there's no question that Godzilla is an icon. Next up, we got the next version of Dracula on this list, and that is Hammer Horror's version of Dracula, portrayed by the iconic Christopher Lee. So yeah, those are the two biggest performances, the two most iconic portrayals of Dracula. And with that being said, of course, he goes into horror icon status. Christopher Lee as Dracula, absolutely 100% horror icon all day and night. And his version of Dracula had a whole franchise around it. He played him 7 times in the Hammer series, Christopher Lee, and I love all those movies, especially Horror of Dracula, which is my favorite vampire movie of all time, my favorite Hammer movie of all time, my favorite Dracula movie, my favorite vampire movie, period. And I love all the sequels too. I love, Dracula Prince of Darkness, Dracula has risen from the grave, Taste the Blood of Dracula, Scars of Dracula, Satanic Rites of Dracula, Dracula AD 1972, all that. I love all of them. Not everybody does, but yeah, absolutely. I love Christopher Lee. So menacing in the role of Dracula. That's what sets him apart, I think, from Bela Lugosi. He's much more intimidating and menacing than the Bela Lugosi version. And he just makes it his own. Awesome, awesome stuff. Next up, we have Hannibal, the Hannibal series, the Hannibal franchise. The cannibal killer known as Doctor Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal Lecter, not Lectric, dummy. Where do we put Hannibal Lecter? Certainly, the film's Silence of the Lambs is absolutely iconic, and it's tough. If you based it on that film alone, I would say Hannibal Lecter is iconic. But you have all the other films to take into account. You have the original Manhunter made for TV film, and then you had Red Dragon, you had Hannibal, which is just basically Hannibal slasher killer. Hannibal really is the only film where Hannibal is the antagonist. Hannibal himself is the central figure, the central villain. And that wasn't as good. It wasn't a great film, really. Although there was a great scene where Hannibal, with involving Ray Liotta, where he takes off the top of his head and like picks at his brain, and Ray Liotta is just sitting there talking and like I don't know how he's still talking and still conscious, but that's a great scene. But as a film itself, it's not great. And then you had Hannibal Rising, which was kind of the prequel film with the young Hannibal Lecter, which wasn't great either. But you did have the television series, which was very good too, with Mads Mikkelsen as Hannibal, was pretty good. It's tough. He probably does deserve to be in the horror icon tier, but I'm gonna put him in legendary status because if you judge on the performance of Anthony Hopkins in The Silence of the Lambs, which was just brilliant and obviously an Oscar-winning portrayal, I just don't think he quite makes horror icon, in my opinion. That's just my opinion, though. I know a lot of people would put him in horror icon status. Next up, we have Jack Torrance from The Shining. Absolutely. And that's tough, because if you base it on The Shining alone and Jack Nicholson's portrayal, I think he's absolutely iconic. And there's so many images of that character, Jack Torrance, in pop culture. I think the character himself and the portrayal of Jack Nicholson is iconic. So I'm putting him in horror icon, baby. I don't care. I know there was the crappy made for TV miniseries, which was not great, but you just can't deny that film is amazing. The Shining film is amazing. I know Stephen King didn't care for it, even though it's based on the Stephen King novel. I still think it's more of a Stanley Kubrick film than a Stephen King film because he does take a lot of liberties. But man, Jack Nicholson is just absolutely phenomenal and iconic and amazing in that film. He's so insane, so over the top, and Jack Nicholson was just born to play that character, and he makes it his own. Next up, we have Leatherface. So we are getting down to the nitty gritty finally, guys. I know this is a massive undertaking, but we're getting there, guys. We're getting there. Next up, we have Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. It's crazy because the franchise itself is just all over the place, especially when you look at the timelines and the continuity is just a mess in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. But if you talk about that original film from 1974, directed by Toby Hooper, it's one of the greatest horror films of all time, in my opinion. And Leatherface in that original film is amazing, portrayed so brilliantly by Gunnar Hansen. I think that character is just amazing. And of course, the character of Leatherface is based on the real life killer, Ed Gein. And which so is Norman Bates, and so is the character of Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, were based on Ed Gein. But I think Leatherface in the original is probably the closest to Ed Gein, because these were like these you know hit killers up in the backwoods, you know these hillbilly cannibals, and that's what Ed Gein was. He was a hillbilly cannibal, and he did create masks made out of human skin. So that's why I think Leatherface is the closest to the actual Ed Gein in real life. And that first film is just phenomenal. I think it's one of the scariest movies ever made. I think it's one of the greatest horror movies. But when you get into the franchise as a whole, I love part two. I know a lot of people don't because of the humor in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. But Toby Hooper did direct the second film, and I love it. I personally love it. When you start getting into part three and four, the next generation, and it does definitely go downhill. But you did have the remake, which was really solid too, from 2003. Very solid remake, and I also liked the beginning, which was the prequel to the remake. Also very good with R. Lee Ermey. After that, it goes downhill again. You had Texas Chainsaw 3D, and then you had Leatherface, and then you had the Netflix Texas Chainsaw movie, which was meh. I don't know, but I gotta put Leatherface in horror icon as a character. You gotta put him in horror icon. Come on, you have to. I'm putting Leatherface in horror icon. I don't care. It's just everybody knows the character of Leatherface by now. And yeah, he's a horror icon. I don't care. Next up, we got the Boogeyman, the Shape, Michael Myers from the Halloween franchise. Yeah. As you all know, I'm a huge fan of Halloween and the Halloween franchise. It's my favorite horror franchise. That's not to say that every film is great. It has its ups and downs, no doubt about it. You got your Resurrection, you got your Halloween 3, which had nothing to do with Michael Myers. You had Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers with crazy Thorn cult stuff. You had the weird, polarizing Halloween Ends. You had the David Gordon Green trilogy, which was not exactly masterful. It had its ups and downs, and just like a lot of the franchise does. But as a whole, I love Michael Myers as a character. He's going in horror icon. I don't care. Of course, Michael Myers' Halloween is iconic. Michael Myers is absolutely iconic, and the Halloween series is iconic. So it's a no-brainer. Of course, he's horror icon all day and night. All right, we got Pamela Voorhees from the original Friday 13th film, which I love personally. Not a lot of people do. A lot of people, whenever they rank Friday 13th, they put it on the bottom tier. And, she has a sympathetic side to her. It's a mother taking revenge on the people that weren't paying attention when her son drowned in the lake, Crystal Lake. And that's her motivation for killing them off one by one. Anyone who dare enter Camp Crystal Lake is fodder for Mrs. Voorhees. A lot of people take issue because, Jason is not the killer in the original film. But I love it because it's a whodunit slasher. We don't know who the killer is until the end, that last 10 to 15 minutes, where it's revealed that Mrs. Voorhees, the mother of Jason, is the killer. And man, what a great performance! She's just batshit crazy. I love it. I love her performance. It's a great character. So where do we put Mrs. Voorhees in the tier list? I'm gonna have to put her in legendary because I know a lot of people will probably put her in killer or maybe even amateur because they don't like the original Friday 13. But yeah, I can't put her in iconic status, of course, because not everybody knows who she is. Most people, when they watch Friday 13th, they watch, like part three when he gets the mask, or part four, the final chapter, or, and any of the other ones. They don't really watch the original or even part two, even. Most people watch Jason with the hockey mask. That's how they see Jason with the hockey mask. That's the iconic look. People don't talk about Pamela Voorhees. Next up, we have the other version of Pennywise, the OG, the original Pennywise, Tim Curry from the It miniseries from Stephen King. Very popular version, and that's why I concluded both the original version and the remake version, because they're both very popular in pop culture. Everybody still remembers Tim Curry as Pennywise, even though the movie itself is kind of cheesy. It's not really that great. But his performance, his look in that costume, and his portrayal of the character is great. He did such a fantastic job. He's very memorable in that performance. It's a great story still, but I don't really think that the movie itself was that great. I prefer the remake from 2017, but you can't deny how popular his portrayal of the character is. So I'm gonna put him in legendary, right next to the remake version of Pennywise. So I think they're equally good, in their own ways. And they both had their own style of portraying the character. They both bring their own flavor to it, and that's great. Next up, we have Pinhead, the Hell Priest. Even though he's never really referred to as Pinhead in the first couple movies, um, we call him Pinhead because he has pins in his head, and he's the lead Cenobite in the Hellraiser series. Absolutely love those original first two films, Hellraiser and Hellraiser 2 Hellbound are awesome. And I love Doug Bradley's portrayal of the character. I love the Cenobites. I love the story of that original film. You know, this crazy guy who opened up this box, the labyrinth configuration that I have here. And it opens up the door to hell, the door to pleasure and pain and perversion and madness and insanity. And, the hell priests are Pinhead and the Cenobites. In the original film, you had the Chatterer, you had the female Cenobite there with the tubes coming out of her neck and her neck split open like a vagina. It's freaky, man. It's very S&M too. It's very sexual. It's very weird and sadistic and masochistic and all that. But yeah, I love those first two movies. Once you get after past that, it gets a little rough. The first, I'd say part three is a lot of fun. And part three is kind of where they make Pinhead like the central villain, kind of the main character. And the problem with that is they kind of tried to make him like Freddy Krueger, making all these one-liners and laughing and having a little bit too much fun, because he wasn't really like that in the first couple of movies. He laughed once or twice, but he wasn't like humorous. And that's how he is in part three, which is kind of where the problems begin with the franchise. And then, then you get to Hellraiser in space with part four, Bloodline, and then yeah, the franchise goes way downhill from there. Of course, part four was the last one that came out in theaters because then they went straight to video after that. And the quality just goes down and down and down from there. But I think the character of Pinhead is a brilliant character. It's such a cool, unique look. This guy that had pins hammered in his head because that was his choice. That was his perversion of preference. Um, before he became a Cenobite, he was just another wacko looking for the next high, and he found it in the box in the labyrinth configuration that released the demons from hell and released all the sick perversions that he wanted. He got what he wanted. And he became a Cenobite and he became the leader of the Cenobites. And he's just so brilliant in the role. And some of my favorite lines in horror history are from Pinhead. And Doug Bradley's portrayal of the character is so great. Even as the series becomes horrible, he always is the one constant that makes it watchable. And they had since replaced him in some of the sequels. Like they first replaced him in Revelations, and then there was Judgment, and then there was the remake from Hulu, which was actually pretty interesting. It wasn't bad. So I really want to put him in iconic status, but because of some of the bad sequels, there was so many bad sequels, I can't really put him in iconic status. And I don't think Pinhead is quite as well known as the people that are on the icon status, so I can't really put him as horror icon, but I'm definitely put him in legendary because he is legendary. Absolutely. And I think Clive Barker is such a brilliant author, and I loved his direction on that first film too. I think it's such a cool concept and a very creative, one of the most creative and original horror films of all time. So, because of that, he goes in legendary. Next up, we have. Wait a minute, I already did the Predator, didn't I? I might have a duplicate there. Yeah. Never mind. We're skipping over the Predator because I already did him. I don't know why I put him in there twice. Next up, we have an interesting one, The Prowler, or Rosemary's Killer, as the film is otherwise known as. Yeah, a slasher came out in 1981 during the slasher boom. And it wasn't quite as popular as some of the other films that came out that year, like My Bloody Valentine also came out that year. And so many great horror movies in general came out in 1981, Evil Dead, The Howling, American Werewolf in London. So many great horror films came out in 1981. You had Halloween 2 that came out, a lot of great slashers. And I do put The Prowler in that category as one of the great slashers of the early 80s and definitely 1981 in particular. One of my favorite slasher movies from 1981. I love the look of The Prowler. Such a cool look for a slasher killer. You got the army veteran with the army fatigues and the mask over his head and the pitchfork. Such a cool look for a killer. I think they need to come out with a Prowler action figure. I think that would be so cool. They came out with My Bloody Valentine. Why not the Prowler? And the Prowler has some really cool, like creative kills and great practical effects from Tom Savini. Some great stuff, when the guy gets the knife through the top of his head down through his chin. Man, it's awesome. Some really nasty kills. I feel like the Prowler is kind of a forgotten slasher. People don't remember it, so I can't really put it that high in the list. I'm gonna have to put the Prowler and Killer. As much as I do love the film, I can't, in all honesty, in all good conscience, put him in legendary or certainly not horror icon. But he's definitely better than amateur. Next up, we have the Tar Man, one of the only two zombie characters that I put on this list, because I wanted to certainly have the zombie genre represented here, but you can't really put that many characters that are zombies in this list. There's a few good ones. There's a couple others I could have put on here, but again, I don't want to be on here for 4 hours. So I just put what I feel the top two zombie characters, and the next one would be the Tar Man from Return of the Living Dead series. He's also featured in the second film too, but definitely more prominently in the first film, Return of the Living Dead. Um, yeah, definitely an iconic zombie character. Just the look of him is so cool. And the actor that portrays him does a great job. The way he moves is so weird and bizarre. And with the brains, he craves brains. That's what's fun about Return of the Living Dead is the zombies specifically want brains. They don't just want to eat the flesh. They want the brains, go right to the source of the character, the source of the human, the brain. That's what they crave. Not that they get knowledge from it or anything per se. They just like to eat brains. They find brains tasty. And the tar man just has such a cool, like decrepit and weird, like greasy, like weird look. It's so cool. But definitely I can't put it. There's not all that much to the character. I certainly cannot put him in horror icon status or even legendary. There's just not enough to the character to put him that far up. But I'm definitely going to put him in killer. Definitely worthy of killer. All right, guys, we only got two left. And next one might be a little bit controversial because not everybody considers it a horror film. Even myself, I have some issues with it, and that is The Terminator. I mean, it's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's an absolutely phenomenal movie. The first two films really are phenomenal. Once you get past Terminator 2 and you get into 3, Rise of the Machines, it's like meh. And then you get into Salvation and Genesis and Dark Fate. Ugh, it's real rough when you get past part 2. But that first film, a lot of people, it's debatable whether it's horror. I feel the way I see the first film, I see it as sci-fi, action, and horror. I feel like it's all three equally. And because of that, I think he's worthy of the list. And that being the Terminator, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, the killer robot. Literally, he is a killing machine, especially when it comes to the first film. Because once you get into the second film, I feel like it's more action, and the Terminator, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, is not a killer anymore because John Connor tells him you can't kill people. So he doesn't kill people. you know, he just maims them and hurts them, but he's not a killer, and he's there to protect John Connor in the second film. So in the first film, he's a straight up villain, almost like a slasher killer because he takes out every Sarah Connor in the phone book. So he's like a serial killer basically, in order to get to the Sarah Connor that he wants and that he was sent back in time to kill, because Sarah Connor is the mother of John Connor, who becomes, the leader of the resistance in the future that goes against Skynet and Cyberdyne systems, you know. But yeah, absolutely love Arnold Schwarzenegger. I prefer him as the killer, as the villain, which he is certainly in the original Terminator. And I love the original Terminator. It's one of my favorite films of all time. Yeah, one of the greatest villains of all time. Brilliant design, such a great look once he gets down to the robot. The exoskeleton is so cool too. Not only is Arnold a badass killing machine, but once he turns into the robot, once his skin is removed and he's just the metal robot, the cyborg, the endoskeleton, it's so badass. Everything about that first movie is badass. It's one of the most badass movies of all time ever made by James Cameron. So, yep, guess where he's going. Horror icon, baby. The Terminator goes in horror icon. I bet it's a shocker for you guys. Yeah, because there is a lot of horror elements in that first film. Once you get past the first film, it becomes more sci-fi action. But that first film has some heavy duty horror elements, like the score is so scary. Uh, Arnold is scary. Arnold is terrifying in that movie. He's absolutely incredibly intimidating. He's vicious, he's brutal, he's menacing. Everything that you want in a horror villain. And that's why he goes in horror icon, baby. All right, one more left, and we have the Gill Man from the Creature from the Black Lagoon franchise. Yes, we have the Gill Man, and there was 3 films, so it is technically a franchise. You have the original Creature from the Black Lagoon, you have Revenge of the Creature, and then you had The Creature Walks Among Us, which is a really funny one, where you see him like, on land, in like he wears clothes and stuff. That's funny. But yeah, The Creature Walks Amongst Us. Definitely, obviously, the classic is the original Creature from the Black Lagoon from Universal. He's one Universal Monsters. Not quite as recognizable as the first the legendary three, Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman, but he's definitely up there. Um, but yeah, when it comes to the look of the creature, it's one of the coolest looking creatures ever made. I mean, the design of the prosthetic makeup and the costume is so cool looking. It's beautiful. I mean, what a cool costume that is. I mean, it's awesome. But the film itself is not that great. It's definitely like an old school classic, but I wouldn't say it's, up there with the great classics in the Universal monsters. I'd put him in legendary, I think. It certainly is legendary. It's a classic film, but it's not as good as, Frankenstein or Bride of Frankenstein or Dracula or Wolfman even. But definitely put him in legendary status for sure. He definitely is one of the Universal monsters, one of the classic monsters, especially the design when it comes to the look of the creature. It's iconic for sure. But the movie itself, I wouldn't say is iconic. And that's it, guys. There you have it. Finally finish this monumental task of ranking all the classic. Woo! I made it, guys. I made it through. I survived. Now, does that make me one of the Survivor girls or Survivor guys? Am I a final guy? Because I made it through this list. Oh my God. What a monumental task, but that was so much fun. Thank you so much for joining me, guys, in ranking the horror icons tier list. Thank you so much and have a great day, guys. And happy Halloween because we got Halloween coming up soon. We're getting to the autumn season and I can't wait. But thank you guys for joining me, and thank you for joining me, Sean Patrick Urshan, in the Horror Corner. Tune in and stay scared. Peace out, guys. Good evening, folks, and we got some brand new merchandise for you over at www.thehorrorcona.com, and that's CONA.com. Representing the Horror Corner. Great new design. We got the Morbid Hour live stream there. You got the Horror Hangout live stream there. And you got my nemesis, the Dark Fate. So grab your t-shirt over at www.thehorrorcona.com. And we also got this beautiful new mug. Look at that. Very, very cool. Thought that came out really nice. So grab your merchandise today over at www.thehorrorcona.com.